Okay, fine. Okay, yeah, it's been long enough. I've been kind of putting off this whole engine bracket mount thing because it actually involves me doing some actual fabrication, which is something that I actually have no experience on how to do. So I guess it's time to just stop procrastinating and get on with it. I think it was one of the first episodes I uploaded, maybe episode 2, where I went out and bought a MIG welder and I was playing around with the settings and trying to get used to using the unit. And I guess I knew that this time was going to come where I'd actually have to start using it in anger and start actually fabricating some of the things I'd need to get the project done. So just some fair warning, the completed parts that you'll see by the end of this video, they're not really complete. They're kind of to the point where I can fit them to the car, and if I was to weld them to the car then they would work. There is still a little bit more refinement to do on those, so I need to do things like drilling the plug weld holes, clean off a few edges, redo a few welds that I'm not too happy with, but all in all this is pretty much the engine brackets done and ready to go on the car. So the next episode after this one you will see them actually on the car, and you'll also see me make the engine mounts themselves. The whole thing's been quite a good learning experience because it's kind of made me realise that I actually don't know how to weld at all, and I think that's one of the first ways of learning anything, is that you understand that actually you know nothing. I think if I didn't really feel the need to make my own engine brackets and my own engine mounts, I don't think I'd ever really learn how to weld myself. So if you're new here, what I'm actually doing is I'm taking a 1.8 20 valve turbo from an Audi TT and I'm putting it in a Nissan Micra with the intention of building what I think will be a pretty competent weekend toy. The project is going to require quite a lot of fabrication, some welding, lots of cutting, grinding, use of different materials and lots of problem solving. And I think... Oh, sorry, I forgot I had a tea brewing. Right, yeah, so engine mount brackets. So the engine mount brackets that come on the Micra are basically just a single piece of stamped 2mm steel that would have been made using a very high pressure press die. It's not something that I have access to, so I'm going to have to come up with something myself. And the way we're going to do that is by using a process called CAD, or Cardboard Aided Design. If you've seen one fabrication series, then you've probably seen them all at this stage. You take a piece of cardboard, you draw out the design, and then you transfer it onto steel, then you make it out of steel, and then the part's complete. The steel that I actually have to make the brackets out of is 2mm thick mild steel, and I don't really have an awful lot of that to play around with, so I don't really want to mess it up and then have to buy more of that stuff. And steel is actually really expensive at the moment, so I don't really have an awful lot to play with. What I do have a lot to play with is this 1mm thick galvanized steel. So what it means that I can do is I can make my cardboard template, I can transfer it onto this steel, I can then also test whether I can bend it properly. That's another thing. See, when you bend material, you've got to take into consideration whether the tool that you're using to bend it is going to interfere with the part itself. And I don't think this is something that a lot of people realise when you're making it out of cardboard, you see. So, because you can just bend cardboard with your hands, it's very easy to kind of go, well, I can make this complex shape out of cardboard, and then when you try to make it out of 2mm thick steel, and you're trying to use, bending brakes or press brakes, you end up not being able to actually complete the bend properly, either because the part collides with itself, or it collides with the tool, or the bending brake is too big for the part, so you end up bending parts of the material that you don't want to bend. I ran into all of those problems when I was making the initial parts out of the thin steel, so that I could redesign them properly and taking those into consideration when making the final part out of 2mm thick steel. Because if you can't bend it in 1mm thick, there's no way you're bending it in 2mm thick, right? The engine side bracket was fairly easy to remove, all the spot welds are easy to see. The gearbox side was a little bit more complicated. The design of the gearbox side is that it kind of hangs over the chassis rail rather than sitting on top of it. There were a lot of spot welds that were underneath the car, and being a Nissan from the 90s, you can probably imagine how trying to find those spot welds was. So actually what I ended up doing was just drilling out what I could and then using a bit of percussive persuasion to remove the rest of it. Nice. With those mounts removed, I was able to get a good view of how things were going to sit. Got rid of all of the nubs that were left over by the spot weld bits. Gave everything a bit of a clean up and put some weld through primer on there just to stop it from rusting. And then I had a pretty good blank canvas. So what I did was I put the engine back in the engine bay again, lined it all up the way I wanted it to be, and I started figuring out whereabouts in the engine bay these brackets needed to go. The way that I determined the position of the engine mount brackets was to first of all figure out where they would have been in relation to the engine on the Audi TT that the engine would have come out of. Luckily I was able to go to my local breakers where there were quite a few cars that have that engine fitted. I found that on both sides the brackets had to come back towards the bulkhead of the car. Basically those mounts are positioned in such a way that they utilize the engine's own center of mass to keep it balanced, because there are only two actual weight supporting mounts for the engine, one on one side and one on the other. The only thing that really stops the engine from twisting when you put torque through it is what's called a dog bone mount, and that sits behind the engine. It attaches to the gearbox and then tie into a strengthened part of the lower bulkhead. So I need to make sure that I adequately replicate that in the Micra as well. So once I'd figured all that out and put all my reference marks on the chassis, I started getting all my cardboard together, and to begin with I started making just piecemeal mounts. And what I mean by that is, instead of trying to make a flat template just using my head, I made all the individual parts and then I would tape them together, and then I would flatten that out, then transfer that to the 1mm steel, test that I can bend it properly on either my vise or using sort of homemade press brake that I made. And then from there, once I kind of refined the design enough, I felt confident enough to move on to making it out of 2mm thick steel. So making it out of the 1mm thick steel meant that I was able to make iterations to the design fairly easily. The problem is when you make it out of cardboard is that cardboard is still quite flimsy. So you can build up the structure using cardboard, but as soon as you put it in place, it has a tendency to flex. And I actually ended up making quite a few different versions of each side. And because I had so much of this steel, it wasn't a big deal. Been to the shops and I got my usual £3 meal deal, but I also got myself some fine markers. Before I was using this quite thick Sharpie, which is it says it's a fine point, but it isn't. So I got these just for better marking, and I also got, who remembers this bad boy? Tractor. I think my license from year 6 is still valid. Got my 2 set squares, 15cm ruler, compass. Right, I've eaten my dinner. It's now started raining again, so sorry if you can hear that in the background, but it's just the way it is. Let's move all that out of the way. Over here is my graveyard of templates and various attempts at engine mounts. I'll show you these now actually. So when you creating a template, quite an iterative process. So if you follow me on Instagram, you've probably seen me post various attempts at making these engine mount brackets. So this is the first one I made. I might even have the original template for it somewhere, the original cardboard one. I think it's probably this one here. And for this one, I just had to follow the contours of the wheel arch, and then it sits on there, and then you've got the bushing that goes through there. And after a bit of refining it ended up like this. And this worked, but it was a bit too big and a bit difficult to make out of one piece. If you look here, you can see it's actually several pieces. So you've got a line there where I was just having trouble getting everything to line up after I'd bent it, so I made it out of several pieces. So that was the first attempt. For my second attempt, I tried to simplify it a little bit. I made the whole design a lot smaller. Smaller should equal stronger. I put a return that goes all the way down, and then there's one that carries along to the wheel arch. It's quite over-welded, but that's just because I wanted to get a bit of practice in. Didn't have an awfully fun time because I forgot to grind the galvanized coating off the edge of the steel there, so that wasn't pleasant. Still quite bendy in the middle there, but you could put a gusset or something there that would keep that solid. So that's the second one. And this is the third one. It has the bushing in place. So this one is actually made out of a single piece, and the way I've managed to do that is you can see it's just a U shape that goes up. Actually, do I have the original? I do, here it is. So this is the flat cardboard template. Folds up like this, and then you've got returns that bend out like that, and then you've got a flap that goes down, and then these bend over the radius and they kind of meet like that. So you kind of end up with, well, you end up with this. This is very strong, quite small. I don't know if I really need an additional like strengthening bit down there, but I've made these shorter and they kind of kick down a bit, whereas the other ones kind of go straight out. I don't feel it needs to go that far back. So this is smaller, easier to make. These are all three of them, right to left. You can see how the design gets simpler and easier to make as I go along. So the gearbox side was a little bit different just because of the way that the mount kind of hangs off the side of the chassis rail rather than sitting on top of it. This one I did it much the same way, so we've got just a really basic piecemeal bracket. So I made this out of separate pieces. That sort of folds like this, and then you've got a return that folds over the front and then hangs over the actual chassis rail so that you can weld it in. Obviously this is incomplete, but it was enough for me to then make version number 2, which if we bend it out, sorry, fold it out like this, and then you've got the returns that fold over there, and then you've got these tabs that hold it to the top of the chassis rail. This is obviously not enough material to do that, so because the only way I'd be able to make that wider is if I go in this direction, so in this direction, but I'd like to have something that goes in this direction too, but that's impossible because if it's flat, you can see it interferes with this middle bit. Actually following just another version of the template here, which just gives a little bit more strength, but again, we don't have this material that goes along the top here, and I'd like that to be a bit wider. So I ended up making 2 separate templates. So this is for the rear, and this one's for the front. And this is kind of why I needed that protractor set, really, because you've got angles here, and the reason why that is because I've made it like this so that you've got the bushing that sits in there in that hole, but you get a little bit of extra strength by using the entire height of the chassis rail rather than it just hanging off the top half of it. Of course, that makes it a bit difficult to make this bend work. If you imagine that, sort of sits like that. But crucially, we've got more sort of material at the top here because we don't have to worry about this bit now. And if we've got the front one here, which is sized slightly different, you can't really tell, but there's actually a 5mm difference between the edge of here and the edge of here and here, and that's just to account for the taper. So you've got 2 separate ones here. So the middle template I made, which was this one here, I did actually make this one out of steel, and it came out like this. And again, because you've got this this kind of awkward bend you've got to do, I actually found that making this even on my press brake, my homemade one, that was really difficult to get right, because you just don't get access to press it in far enough without this part colliding with the tool. In addition, it's just really awkward to do, because if you try and bend this like this, you can't bend it without also bending that. and you can see where I've had to hammer it back straight again. You can see there's a slight variation there. There's a slight dent. So I don't think that's the best way to do it anyway. So I've abandoned this and went straight to the 2-piece design like this one, which I've already made from 1mm steel, and I'll show you that now. And here they are, made in steel. So these are just bent, but they're not welded. I've decided well, because there's just the way these are designed, the only actual welding you need to do is just on the returns, but I just bent these instead. I don't have enough of welding thin steel anyway. So this is just a good proof of concept. So that's the rear one towards the rear of the car, and that's the front one, and they kind of match like this, and that's fine. I think I did a pretty good job of making it so the radius of the bracket kind of matches that of the bushing. I don't think that matters too much, but I think it just looks a bit nicer. So let's see what these look like on the car. Right, so here we are with them in the car like this. So these are just sitting in place, and you can see where I've marked there where the center of it needs to be, and then the edges, just so that I know that it lines up properly when I put it in. So as we can see here, don't get a very good angle because I've got engine in the way, but it kind of follows the curvature of this panel here, and it also does it on this side, and then it would just weld down onto this this chassis rail here, and then at the front as well. I'm not 100% happy with this because I don't know if you can see very well, but that return there doesn't actually hit anything. There's nothing, it's just sitting there floating in midair, so I need to refine this design just a little bit. The gearbox side I'm a bit more happy with, so here it is. And again, this is just sitting in place by friction, and you can kind of just see how you've got all of this at the top here. So a few plug welds, maybe a seam or something on the end, just to keep it super secure. Same at the bottom. And then maybe just a gusset over the top here, just to really strengthen it. But I think this is probably going to be fine. If we just look over the top here, you can see that the bushing sits parallel with the gearbox, even though there is actually a taper. It tapers outwards. Between here and here, there's about 5mm of extra sort of distance that's needed. So I've had to account for that. One thing to mention as well, I know this looks a little bit strange because this angle here is not quite the same as it is over here. This was just where I accidentally marked the this slope wrong. It's supposed to come up to here and then come down and meet down there. I just didn't measure it properly, so that's the reason why that looks weird. I've already corrected the template on this, so that's where it is, and I've just taped that back on like that. So that won't be an issue when I make the final piece. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take these templates and we're going to transfer them onto this 2mm thick steel, and then it's just a case of cutting it out, bending what needs to be bent, and then welding it together where it needs to be welded, and then it should be ready to go in the car with a little bit of prep work. And that's pretty much the engine mount brackets done. I still need to do the rear gearbox mount, the dog bone mount. That's for torque reaction. That's going to come in sort of a future part once I've got the engine mounts all properly done. Once I've got the engine hanging in the bay, I can then work out where I need to position those. So I kind of need to do this first. In the next episode, you are going to see me doing the actual engine mounts. That's the part that connects the engine to the chassis. If you aren't already, then get subscribed so that you don't miss that. If you've watched up until this point, thank you very much. I hope it's been informative and maybe a little bit entertaining for you. I have an Instagram account, cg10.uk. I've been a little bit quiet on YouTube as of late because I've just been busy getting on with this, but I have been putting pictures up on my Instagram account so that people can sort of see progress as and when I make it. Anyway, that's going to do it from me. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.